He gave up his grandmother's special meal to help a shivering stranger. The next morning, when lawyers showed up at his door, his mother couldn't believe. Andre pulled his worn jacket tighter against the biting Chicago wind. His grandmother's food container felt warm against his chest, protected inside his coat. Snow crunched under his shoes as he walked down Michigan Avenue, past the fancy stores with their New Year's Eve displays. "Be careful with the container, baby," his grandmother had said earlier that day, pressing it into his hands. The plastic was old but clean, just like everything else they owned. "I made extra rice and beans. Should last you a couple days." He'd watched her portion out the food that morning, her hands shaking slightly as she spooned it into the container. The kitchen in her small apartment had smelled like garlic and oregano, the same smells that always meant safety to him. "Thanks, Grandma," he'd said, hugging her thin shoulders. "But you sure you got enough for yourself? Don't you worry about me." She'd patted his cheek with her rough palm. "Just focus on those studies. Your daddy would have wanted that." The mention of his father made Andre's throat tight. 2 years had passed since the funeral, but some days it felt like yesterday. He remembered his dad's voice. "Education is the one thing they can't take from you, son." Now, at 13, Andre understood what his father meant. He saw it in the way some store security guards followed him around, in the whispers when he raised his hand in class, in the surprise on people's faces when he got the highest math score again. The wind picked up, sending a spray of snow into his face. Andre ducked his head and kept walking. He had to get home before dark. His mom would be finishing her shift at the hospital soon, and she worried when he was out late. That's when he saw the old man. The bench was covered in snow, except for the small space where he sat. He wore a thin jacket, much thinner than Andre's, and a threadbare blanket across his legs. His white beard had icicles in it. Andre almost walked past like everyone else was doing. The rush hour crowd flowed around the bench like water around a rock, eyes straight ahead or locked on phones. But something made him slow down. The old man's hands caught his attention first. They were dark like Andre's, but weathered, trembling as they tried to pull the blanket tighter. His eyes stared straight ahead, maintaining a dignity that struck Andre hard in the chest. Andre's feet stopped moving. The container felt heavier against his chest. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head. "Always keep a little extra, baby. You never know who might need it." But this was his food for the next 2 days. His mom's next paycheck wasn't until Friday, and they were already stretching things thin. He thought about the half-empty fridge at home, about his growing appetite that his mom teased him about. The old man coughed, a rough sound that seemed to shake his whole body. Andre's hand moved to the container inside his jacket. The plastic was still warm. "Keep walking," he told himself. "It's not your problem." But his feet wouldn't move. He watched his breath form clouds in the freezing air, mixing with the steam from the heating grates and the exhaust from passing buses. The sky was turning the deep blue of early winter evening, and the Christmas lights in the store windows were starting to stand out more. A woman hurried past, designer boots crunching in the snow, phone pressed to her ear as she complained about holiday party plans. A group of tourists argued about dinner reservations. A street vendor packed up his hot dog cart, counting the day's money. The old man shifted on the bench, and their eyes met. Andre saw something in those eyes that hit him like a punch to the stomach. They were clear and intelligent, full of a sadness that seemed too big for one person to carry. But there was something else too, pride, the same kind he saw in his grandmother's eyes when she insisted on cooking for him, even though her arthritis made her hands hurt. The man nodded slightly, a gesture so small Andre almost missed it. It wasn't asking for anything. It was just acknowledgement, one human being to another. Andre's hands were shaking now, and not from the cold. The food container pressed against his ribs, still radiating warmth. His grandmother had always told him that blessings multiply when you share them, but she'd also taught him to be practical, to take care of himself in a world that often wouldn't. A gust of wind swept down the street, making the old man huddle deeper into his thin jacket. The Christmas lights in the store windows blinked on and off, casting alternating shadows across his face. Andre took a deep breath. The cold air burned his lungs. He took one step toward the bench, then another. The old man looked up again, and this time their eyes locked. Andre felt like he was standing on the edge of something important, something bigger than just a kid with a container of food and a stranger on a bench. "Excuse me, sir," Andre said, his voice cracking slightly. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. "Are you hungry?" The old man stared at Andre for a long moment. His eyes moved from Andre's face to the container he was pulling from his jacket, then back again. "Son," he said, his voice deep but quiet, "you don't need to do that." Each word came out with a small cloud of vapor in the cold air. Andre's hands tightened on the container. "I want to, sir. If you're hungry." A bus roared past, splashing slush onto the curb. The old man shifted on the bench, making room. Andre hesitated, then sat down, leaving space between them. The bench was cold, even through his jeans. "I'm Andre," he said, unsnapping the container's lid. Steam rose into the frigid air, carrying the smell of his grandmother's cooking. "Thomas," the man said. "Mr. Thomas." He straightened his back slightly, like the introduction had reminded him of something. "You should be home, Andre. It's getting dark." "Yes, sir. But—" Andre looked down at the food, then held it out. "My grandma made too much." Mr. Thomas's hands shook as he accepted the container. His fingers were red from the cold, the knuckles swollen. He looked at the food for a long moment. "Your grandmother," he said slowly. "She must be something special." "She is." Andre watched as Mr. Thomas carefully balanced the container on his lap. "She cooks for me a lot. Says I'm too skinny." That brought a small smile to Mr. Thomas's face. "Grandmothers are like that." He picked up the plastic fork Andre offered. "Mine was too long time ago." Andre watched as Mr. Thomas took a small, careful bite. Something in the old man's face changed. A softening around the eyes, a slight relaxing of his shoulders. "This is good," Mr. Thomas said. "Real good?" He ate slowly, with deliberate dignity. "Reminds me of home." "Where's home, sir?" "Used to be here in Chicago. Nice house in Hyde Park." Mr. Thomas took another bite. "Things change, though. Life has a way of—" He stopped, shook his head. "Well, doesn't matter now." Andre thought about his own home, the apartment he shared with his mom. The heating that worked most of the time, the windows that leaked a little when it rained. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. "How long have you been?" Andre gestured vaguely at the bench, the street. "Out here?" Mr. Thomas set the fork down for a moment. 8 months, 2 weeks, 3 days. He said it precisely, like he'd been counting. "Never thought I'd be counting days on a bench on Michigan Avenue." A group of teenagers walked past, laughing about something on their phones. One of them glanced at Andre and Mr. Thomas, then quickly looked away. "You're in school?" Mr. Thomas asked, changing the subject. "Yes, sir. 8th grade." "Good. That's good." Mr. Thomas nodded. "What's your favorite subject?" "Math," Andre said without hesitation. "And science?" "I like figuring things out." "A thinker." Mr. Thomas smiled again, bigger this time. "We need more of those." Andre noticed Mr. Thomas had only eaten half the food. "You can have the rest, sir." "Really?" Mr. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. "You sure? Growing boy like you needs his strength." "I'm sure." Andre pulled his jacket tighter. "My grandma always makes extra." Mr. Thomas nodded slowly. "Your grandmother teaches you well." He took another bite. "My wife used to cook like this. Before she—" His voice trailed off. Andre waited, but Mr. Thomas didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he stared at the passing traffic, his eyes distant. "I had a corner office once," he said suddenly. 43rd floor, looking out over the lake. Beautiful view. He gestured toward the tall buildings around them. "Funny how things work out. Now every office is my office." He tried to laugh, but it turned into a cough. Andre unzipped his jacket. Under it, he wore a hoodie his dad had given him the last Christmas before. He pushed the thought away. "Sir, would you like my extra layer?" "I don't need it." Mr. Thomas stopped coughing. He looked at Andre with an expression that made Andre's chest hurt. "No, son. Keep it." Mr. Thomas straightened up again. "Tell me about your family. Your parents must be proud, raising such a thoughtful young man." Andre swallowed hard. "My mom, she works really hard. At the hospital. She's a nurse's aide." "And your father?" "He died 2 years ago." Andre kicked at some snow with his shoe. "Cancer." Mr. Thomas set the food container down carefully. I'm sorry, son. That's hard. They sat in silence for a moment, watching their breath cloud in the air. The street was getting darker, the holiday lights brighter. More people hurried past, heads down against the cold. You know what I miss most about my office? Mr. Thomas said suddenly. Not the view, not the salary. It was helping people. Had a scholarship program for kids like you. Smart kids. Kids who just needed a chance. Andre turned to look at him. What happened to it? Mr. Thomas's face tightened. Medical bills happened. Insurance companies. Lawyers. He shook his head. But the fund, it's still there. Just frozen. Like everything else in my life right now. A police car cruised by slowly. The officer inside glanced at them, then drove on. You should go home, Andre, Mr. Thomas said. Your mother will worry. Andre checked his phone. 5 missed texts from his mom. He stood up, snow falling from his jeans. Sir, will you be here tomorrow? Mr. Thomas looked up at him. Planning on bringing more of your grandmother's cooking? Maybe. Andre shuffled his feet. If you want. You're a good boy, Andre. Mr. Thomas held out the empty container. Thank your grandmother for me. Andre took the container. You never finished telling me about the scholarship program. Mr. Thomas's eyes sparked with something. Maybe hope, maybe memory. Come back tomorrow, if you want to hear an old man's stories. Andre nodded. I will, Mr. Thomas. As he walked away, Andre looked back once. Mr. Thomas sat straight on the bench, his thin blanket pulled tight around his shoulders, watching the last light fade from the winter sky. He looked less like a homeless man and more like a king who had lost his throne, but not his dignity. Andre's phone buzzed again. His mom's text read, Where are you, baby? Getting worried. He typed back, On my way home. Had to help someone. The wind cut through a single layer now, but somehow he felt warmer than before. Tomorrow, he decided he'd bring 2 containers. One for him, one for Mr. Thomas. And maybe, just maybe, he'd learn more about that scholarship program. His grandmother always said God worked in mysterious ways. Andre wasn't sure about God, but he was sure about one thing. Something important had happened on that bench today. Something that wasn't finished yet. The next day, Andre's feet crunched through fresh snow on Michigan Avenue. He carried 2 containers this time, both warm against his chest. His grandmother hadn't asked questions when he requested double portions. She just smiled and filled the containers. Mr. Thomas sat in the same spot, snow collecting on his shoulders. His eyes brightened when he saw Andre. You came back, he said. Yes, sir. Andre brushed snow off the bench and sat down. Brought dinner. Mr. Thomas watched as Andre pulled out the containers. Your mother know you're here? Told her I was helping someone. Andre handed him a container. She said be home by 6. They sat quietly for a moment, steam rising from their food. The temperature had dropped even lower, and Andre's toes felt numb inside his boots. You said you'd tell me about the scholarship program, Andre said, taking a bite. Mr. Thomas nodded slowly. Did more than just give money. We mentored the kids, helped them apply to colleges. Some of them are doctors now. Engineers. He paused. One's a judge in Detroit. What happened? Really? Mr. Thomas set his fork down. Pancreatic cancer. Same thing that took your father. He stared at the passing traffic. Caught it late. By then, well, treatment's expensive. Insurance only covers so much. Had to sell everything. House, car, investments. Even then, it wasn't enough. But you got better? Better enough to be here. Mr. Thomas gestured at the street. Hospitals don't care if you were a CEO once. Bill comes due, they want their money. A woman walking her dog passed by. The dog pulled toward them, but she yanked it away, hurrying past. 30 years in finance, Mr. Thomas continued. Built that scholarship fund from nothing. Helped dozens of kids. His hands shook as he picked up his fork again. Now I can't even help myself. Andre thought about his father's hospital bills, the endless paperwork his mother still dealt with. It's not fair. Life rarely is, son. Mr. Thomas took another bite. But you know what I learned? Fairness isn't what matters. It's what you do anyway. Is that why you started the scholarship? Partly. Mr. Thomas smiled slightly. When I was your age, someone helped me. Teacher saw I was good with numbers, got me into a special program. Changed my life. He looked at Andre. Sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you. Andre thought about his math teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, who gave him extra problems to solve, who told him he could be an engineer someday. The fund's still there, Mr. Thomas said, just frozen until the legal mess gets sorted out. $2 million, waiting to help kids like you. He coughed a deep, rattling sound. If I could just... He broke off, coughing harder. Andre patted his back awkwardly. When the coughing subsided, Mr. Thomas straightened up. Sorry about that. Cold weather. Here? Andre pulled off his scarf, his only one, and held it out. No, son. Keep it. Please, Mr. Thomas. My mom can give me another one. Mr. Thomas looked at the scarf for a long moment, then took it with trembling hands. As he wrapped it around his neck, Andre saw tears in his eyes. You remind me of myself at your age, Mr. Thomas said quietly. Always trying to fix things. Did you? Fix things? Some things. Mr. Thomas touched the scarf. Not everything, but enough to matter. The street lights flickered on, casting long shadows. Andre checked his phone. 30 minutes until he had to head home. Tell me about your business, he said. Before everything happened, Mr. Thomas's face lit up. He talked about investment strategies, about helping small businesses grow, about creating opportunities in neighborhoods like Andre's. His voice grew stronger, his gestures more animated. The key is seeing potential, he said. Not just in markets and people. That's what the scholarship fund was about. Investing in potential. Like you did with those kids who became doctors? Exactly. Mr. Thomas nodded. Money's just a tool. The real investment is in dreams, in possibilities. He looked at Andre. What's your dream, son? Andre hesitated. He'd never told anyone except his mom. I want to design buildings. Like sustainable ones that help the environment and stuff. An architect? An engineer? Maybe. I like the math part. Mr. Thomas smiled broadly. That's exactly the kind of thing our scholarship. He stopped, his face falling. Well, it used to be. Andre's phone buzzed. A text from his mom. Time to head home. I have to go, he said, standing up. But I'll come back tomorrow. Mr. Thomas shook his head. You've done enough, son. Got your own life to live. Please? I want to hear more about the businesses you helped. Mr. Thomas was quiet for a moment. You really interested in all that? Yes, sir. And Andre gathered his courage. Maybe you could help me with some math? If you're not too busy? That made Mr. Thomas laugh, a real laugh this time. Not too busy at all? He gestured at the bench. Office hours or whenever you want. Andre grinned. Tomorrow then? Tomorrow. Mr. Thomas wrapped the scarf tighter. And Andre? Thank you. Not just for the food. As Andre walked home, his mind raced with thoughts of scholarship funds and investment strategies, of dreams and possibilities. The cold didn't bother him as much now. His phone buzzed again. His mom. Everything okay? He typed back, yeah. Learning a lot. The city lights reflected off the fresh snow, making everything glow. Andre thought about Mr. Thomas's words about potential, about investing in people. He thought about his own dreams of designing buildings, of making things better. Maybe he thought this wasn't just about sharing food anymore. Maybe it was about something bigger, something that could change both their lives. He hurried home through the gathering darkness, already planning what questions he'd ask tomorrow. The third day dawned even colder than the last. Andre's mom caught him packing 2 containers in the kitchen. Baby, who are you feeding? She asked, still in her nurse's aide scrubs from the night shift. Andre paused. Remember that man I told you about? On Michigan Avenue? His mom's face tightened. A homeless man? Andre, that's dangerous. He's not dangerous, Mom. He's... Andre searched for the words. He's like Grandpa would have been if things had gone different. His mom sat down at their small kitchen table. Tell me about him. Andre told her everything about Mr. Thomas's past, the scholarship fund, the kids he'd helped. His mom listened, her tired eyes watching his face. You're sure about this? She asked when he finished. Yes, ma'am. She was quiet for a moment. Take my thermos, too. Fill it with hot coffee. Andre hugged her tight. Thanks, Mom. Be careful, she called as he headed out. And Andre, I'm proud of you. The walk to Michigan Avenue felt shorter now, even through the new snow. Andre spotted Mr. Thomas from a block away, sitting straighter today, still wearing Andre's scarf. Brought coffee, Andre said, sitting down. And Mom sent extra food. Mr. Thomas's hands wrapped around the thermos. Your mother knows about me? Told her this morning. Andre pulled out the containers. She understands. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching people rush past. The coffee steam mixed with their breath in the cold air. Been thinking about what you said yesterday, Mr. Thomas said finally. About engineering? Yes, sir. Got some math problems for you. Mr. Thomas reached into his coat, pulled out a folded piece of paper. The equations were written in neat, precise handwriting, used to give these to scholarship candidates. Andre took the paper eagerly. The problems were harder than anything he'd seen in school. Calculus maybe, or beyond. But something about them made sense to him. Try the first one, Mr. Thomas said. Andre borrowed Mr. Thomas's pen, worked through the problem step by step. His tongue stuck out slightly as he concentrated. Here, he said finally, showing his work. Mr. Thomas studied it, nodding slowly. Perfect. Even showed your work better than some college kids I knew. Andre beamed. Can you explain how it applies to buildings? For the next hour, Mr. Thomas taught him about load-bearing calculations, stress factors, environmental impact formulas. Andre soaked it all in, asking questions, making connections. You've got a mind for this, Mr. Thomas said. Real talent. Really? Really? Mr. Thomas took a long drink of coffee. Reminds me of this kid we helped back in 15. Similar spark. He's designing bridges in California now. Through your scholarship? Mr. Thomas's eyes grew distant. The Thomas Foundation for Educational Excellence still exists technically. The money's there, just trapped. Because of the medical bills? Legal complications. Banks froze, everything went I. He gestured at his current situation. Even my lawyers stopped returning calls. Andre thought for a moment. But if you could reach him? Maybe. But phones? Mr. Thomas shrugged. Library computers have time limits. Hard to navigate legal websites. Fill out forms. Andre pulled out his phone. Use mine? Mr. Thomas stared at the offered phone. Son, please? Just try. Slowly, Mr. Thomas took the phone. His fingers shook as he dialed a number from memory. Law Offices of Harris and Block. A voice answered on speaker. This is Thomas Wheeler. I need to speak with James Harris. One moment. A long pause. I'm sorry, Mr. Harris isn't taking. Tell him it's about the Educational Excellence Fund. Mr. Thomas's voice strengthened. And tell him I'm with a potential candidate. Another pause. Then a new voice. Tom? God, we've been trying to find you. Hello, James. Mr. Thomas's hand tightened on the phone. We need to talk about unfreezing the fund. Where are you? Are you okay? Michigan Avenue. With a young man named Andre. 13 years old, brilliant at mathematics. Wants to be an engineer. Andre listened as Mr. Thomas described their meetings, his test problems, Andre's solutions. His voice grew more confident with each word. Send me the kid's information, the lawyer said. If he's as good as you say. Better? Mr. Thomas looked at Andre. Much better. They talked for 20 more minutes about legal documents and board meetings and trust regulations. Andre understood only half of it, but he saw the change in Mr. Thomas's face. Hope replacing resignation. We'll send someone tomorrow, the lawyer said finally. 10 a.m., same spot. Don't go anywhere, Tom. When the call ended, Mr. Thomas handed the phone back with shaking hands. Thank you, he whispered. Will it work? Andre asked. The scholarship? Maybe. Probably. Mr. Thomas smiled. Definitely. They sat quietly for a moment, watching the snow fall. Why me? Andre asked finally. There's lots of kids good at math. Because you saw me, Mr. Thomas said simply. Not the homeless man, not the failure. Me? He touched the scarf around his neck. Do you know how many people walk past this bench every day? Thousands. But you stopped. You shared your food. You listened. Anyone would have. No. Mr. Thomas shook his head. They wouldn't. That's exactly what makes you special, Andre. Not just the math, though that's impressive. It's your heart. Andre felt his face grow warm despite the cold. The fund was always about more than grades, Mr. Thomas continued. It was about finding young people who could change the world. Not just with their minds, but with their humanity. He pulled out the paper with math problems again. Want to try another one? They worked through problems until the street lights came on. Mr. Thomas explained each solution, connecting them to real-world engineering challenges. Andre's mind buzzed with new knowledge, new possibilities. 10 a.m. tomorrow, Mr. Thomas said as Andre packed up to leave. Can you come? It's Saturday. No school. Bring your mother, if she wants. Mr. Thomas straightened his shoulders. Time to make things right. Andre stood up, hesitated, then hugged the old man. Mr. Thomas stiffened in surprise, then hugged back. Thank you, Andre whispered. No, son. Mr. Thomas's voice was rough. Thank you for giving an old man back his purpose. Walking home, Andre's phone buzzed. A text from his mom. How's your friend? Andre smiled. Typed back. Better. Much better. Can you come with me tomorrow at 10? The reply came quickly. Of course, baby. Tell me everything when you get home. The snow was falling harder now, but Andre barely noticed the cold. His mind was full of equations and possibilities, of bridges waiting to be built. Not just of steel and concrete, but between people, between past and future, between what was and what could be. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Andre barely slept that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through the events of the past few days. The math problems Mr. Thomas had given him sat on his desk, worked and reworked until the paper was soft from handling. At 7 a.m., his mom knocked on his door. You're already up? Couldn't sleep, Andre said, pulling on his warmest sweater. She sat on his bed, still in her night robe. Tell me more about this meeting. Andre explained about the lawyer, the scholarship fund, everything Mr. Thomas had told him. His mom listened, her face serious. Baby, she said finally, I don't want you getting your hopes up too high. Sometimes things don't. I know, Mom. Andre touched the math problems on his desk. But Mr. Thomas is different. He's for real. She studied his face. Okay, let's get some breakfast, then head down there early. They arrived at Michigan Avenue at 9:30. The morning sun made the fresh snow blindingly bright. Mr. Thomas wasn't on his usual bench. Andre's stomach dropped. He's usually here. Let's wait, his mom said, but he heard the doubt in her voice. 9:40 came and went. Then 9:45. Andre paced in the snow, checking his phone every minute. At 9:50, he spotted a figure walking slowly up the street. Mr. Thomas, but different. He'd somehow found a way to clean up. His beard was trimmed, his clothes still worn but tidier. He still wore Andre's scarf. Mr. Thomas. The old man's face broke into a smile. Andre, and this must be your mother. Sarah Williams, Andre's mom said, extending her hand. Thank you for helping my son with math. Thank you for raising such a fine young man. Mr. Thomas shook her hand. And for the coffee yesterday. They cleared the snow off the bench. Andre noticed his mom watching Mr. Thomas. The way he carried himself, spoke, moved. He saw the moment she realized Andre was right, that this was no ordinary homeless man. At 9:58, a black car pulled up to the curb. Two men in suits got out. Tom, the older one said, walking over. You look like hell, James. I know. Mr. Thomas stood to shake hands. But I'm here. The lawyer, James Harris, turned to Andre and his mom. Mrs. Williams? I'm James Harris. This is David Chun, our foundation specialist. They exchanged handshakes, introductions. Mr. Harris pulled out a tablet. Tom, we've kept the fund operational. The board met yesterday. Emergency session. They've agreed to unfreeze operations under certain conditions. Mr. Thomas nodded. Go on. First, you need to get back on your feet. We've arranged temporary housing, medical care. I don't need charity. It's not charity, Tom. It's protecting the foundation's interests. You're still the primary trustee. Andre watched Mr. Thomas process this. And the second condition? Mr. Harris smiled. You need to identify the first new scholarship recipient. The board needs to confirm you haven't lost your eye for talent. Everyone turned to look at Andre. He felt his face grow hot. Show them, Mr. Thomas said quietly. Andre pulled out the math problems, handed them over. Mr. Chen studied them, eyebrows rising. You solved these? He asked Andre. Yes, sir. Mr. Thomas helped explain some parts. These are college-level problems. Mr. Chen looked at Andre's mom. Has he been tested for advanced placement? He's in all honors classes, she said. His teachers say he should be in college courses already, Mr. Thomas interrupted. Look at his work on the structural integrity calculations. perfect understanding of the principles. Mr. Harris made some notes on his tablet. Mrs. Williams, would you and Andre be willing to meet with our educational assessment team next week? Andre's mom gripped his shoulder. Of course. There's more, Mr. Thomas said. He pulled out more papers from his coat. Show them what you designed yesterday, Andre. Andre handed over his rough sketches, a building design he'd worked on after getting home based on Mr. Thomas's teachings. Solar panels integrated into curved walls, rainwater collection systems, innovative support structures. Mr. Chin whistled softly. This is impressive. That's my condition, Mr. Thomas said firmly. Before I agree to anything, Andre gets the first scholarship, full ride, all the way through graduate school if he wants it. Tom, Mr. Harris started, there are procedures. No. Mr. Thomas's voice was steel. This boy shared his food with a stranger, gave me his scarf, brought me back to life. He looked at Andre. The fun was always about more than just grades. It was about character, about seeing potential not just in numbers, but in people. The lawyers exchanged looks. We'll need to do the formal assessments, Mr. Harris said finally. But I think we can work with that. Andre's mom's grip on his shoulder tightened. What exactly does this scholarship cover? Everything, Mr. Thomas said before the lawyers could answer. Tuition, books, housing, meal plan, plus mentoring, internships, career guidance. He smiled. And math problems, lots of math problems, Mr. Harris nodded. We'll have the paperwork ready Monday. But first, he turned to Mr. Thomas. Let's get you somewhere warm, Tom. A lot of people have been worried about you. I need a minute, Mr. Thomas said. With Andre and his mother, the lawyers stepped away. Mr. Thomas turned to face Andre and his mom. Mrs. Williams, he said softly, you've raised an extraordinary young man. He saw something everyone else walked past. He gave without expecting anything in return. He touched the scarf around his neck. He reminded an old fool what really matters. Andre's mom wiped her eyes. He's his father's son. And yours? Mr. Thomas turned to Andre. Son, this isn't charity. It's investment. In you, in your dreams, in what you'll build someday. Not just buildings, though I expect great things there, but connections. Bridges between people. Andre tried to speak, couldn't pass the lump in his throat. The best way to thank me? Mr. Thomas continued. Study hard, dream big, and someday, when you're successful, remember this bench. Remember there are always people worth stopping for. I will, Andre managed. I promise. Mr. Thomas hugged him, then Andre's mom. I'll see you Monday. Bring your appetite. I know a good place for lunch. And Andre, yes, sir? Bring more math problems, hard ones. They watched as Mr. Thomas walked to the waiting car with the lawyers. Just before getting in, he turned back. Andre, yes, sir? Keep the scarf. It looks better on you anyway. The black car pulled away. Andre stood in the snow with his mom, her arm around his shoulders. You were right, she whispered. He is different. Andre touched the papers in his pocket, his building designs, his dreams given form. Mom? Yes, baby? Can we go to Grandma's? I want to tell her everything. Of course. She kissed his forehead. And Andre, your daddy would be so proud of you right now. They walked home through the morning sunshine, their footprints leaving parallel tracks in the fresh snow. Andre thought about Mr. Thomas's words about bridges between people. He'd already started building them. The walk to his grandmother's apartment felt dreamlike. Andre kept touching the papers in his pocket, making sure they were real. His mom called ahead, her voice excited as she told his grandmother they were coming with news. Your grandmother's probably cooking already, she said. Hanging up? Andre smiled. She always is. Snow crunched under their feet as they walked. The city felt different somehow, bigger, full of possibilities he'd never seen before. He looked up at the buildings they passed, seeing them with new eyes. Not just structures anymore, but puzzles to solve, problems to work out. Tell me what you're thinking, his mom said. About buildings. About Mr. Thomas's math problems, Andre paused. About Dad. She squeezed his shoulder. He wanted this for you. Education, opportunities. Would he have liked Mr. Thomas? Baby, he would have loved him. They climbed the stairs to his grandmother's third-floor apartment. Before they could knock, the door opened. The smell of cornbread and collard greens wafted out. "What's this news?" his grandmother demanded, pulling them inside. "Sarah, you're grinning like a lottery winner." Andre's mom pushed him forward. "Tell her, baby." He started slowly, then the words tumbled out faster about Mr. Thomas, the scholarship, the lawyers, everything. His grandmother sat heavily in her worn armchair. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "And this all started with my cooking?" "Your extra portions, Mama," Andre's mom said, always making sure he had enough to share. His grandmother wiped her eyes. "Your daddy always said, Mama, your cooking's gonna change lives someday." She laughed softly. Just didn't know how. They sat down to eat, but Andre could barely focus on his food. His mind kept going back to the bench, to Mr. Thomas's face when the lawyers arrived. "What happens Monday?" his grandmother asked. "Meeting with the foundation people," his mom said. "They want to test Andre's math skills, talk about his future." "And Mr. Thomas?" "They're getting him help. A place to stay, medical care." Andre pushed his collard greens around his plate. "What if I'm not smart enough? What if I mess up the tests?" "Stop that." His grandmother's voice was firm. "Mr. Thomas saw something in you. That man was a millionaire, ran a whole foundation. He knows talent when he sees it. But, no buts." She reached across the table, took his hand. "You're your father's son. He never doubted himself, and neither should you." After dinner, Andre sat by his grandmother's window, watching the snow fall. He pulled out his building designs, showed them to her. "See this part here?" He pointed to the curved walls. "It's designed to collect solar energy. And these channels? They gather rainwater for the whole building." His grandmother studied the drawings. "You did this yourself?" "Mr. Thomas helped. Taught me about load-bearing calculations and stuff." On a bench in the cold, she shook her head, smiling. God works in mysterious ways. Later on the walk home, Andre and his mom stopped at the store. She bought him a new notebook, good pencils, a scientific calculator. "For your designs," she said. At home, Andre couldn't sleep again. He sat at his desk under his lamp, working on new building designs. His mind felt electric, alive with possibilities. Around midnight, his mom knocked softly. "Can't sleep? Too excited?" She came in, sat on his bed. "Want to talk about it?" Andre turned from his desk. "What if this changes everything?" "It will, baby. That's not a bad thing. But what about you and Grandma?" She came over, hugged him from behind. "We're not going anywhere. Success doesn't mean leaving people behind. It means bringing them with you." Andre thought about that. Like Mr. Thomas. He helped all those other kids, made their lives better. Exactly. She looked at his drawings. "And someday you'll do the same." "I want to design buildings that help people," Andre said. "Like affordable housing that's also good for the environment. Buildings that make neighborhoods better." Your father used to say something like that. About making the world better, one small thing at a time. Andre worked on his designs until his eyes got heavy. His mom had gone to bed, but he could hear her moving around, probably too excited to sleep too. He thought about Monday, about the tests and meetings ahead. But instead of fear, he felt ready. Mr. Thomas's voice echoed in his head. "Dream big." Finally, around 2 a.m., Andre crawled into bed. Through his window, he could see the city lights reflecting off the snow. Somewhere out there, Mr. Thomas was sleeping in a real bed tonight, safe and warm. Andre touched the scarf hanging on his bedpost. A simple piece of cloth, but it had connected two lives, started something bigger than either of them. His phone lit up, a text from an unknown number. "Get some sleep, son. Big days ahead." TW, Andre smiled in the darkness. Mr. Thomas had a phone now. Things were already changing. He texted back, "Working on new designs. Harder math problems Monday." The reply came quickly. "Always. Dream big." Andre closed his eyes, still smiling. In his mind, buildings rose against the sky, not just steel and glass, but hope made solid. Bridges between people, just like Mr. Thomas said. Tomorrow would bring paperwork and tests, lawyers and plans. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of his room, Andre knew one thing for certain. He'd stopped on that bench for a reason. Not just to help someone, but to learn that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. His last thought before sleep took him was of his father. "I'll make you proud, Dad," he whispered. "Promise." Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the city in fresh possibilities. And somewhere in Chicago, two people, a boy and an old man, dreamed of buildings reaching for the sky, of bridges yet to be built, of lives about to change. Monday couldn't come soon enough. Monday morning arrived with a knock on their apartment door. Andre sat at the kitchen table, already dressed in his best clothes, the ones usually reserved for church. His mom opened the door to find Mr. Harris and Mr. Chun, along with two other people carrying briefcases. "Mrs. Williams," Mr. Harris said, "this is Dr. Laura Martinez, our educational specialist, and Michael Wong from the Foundation Board." Andre's mom invited them in, apologizing for their small living room. The lawyers and specialists squeezed onto their worn couch, pulling out laptops and papers. "First," Mr. Harris said, "an update on Tom. He's settled in a temporary housing, seeing doctors today. Is he okay?" Andre asked quickly. Mr. Harris smiled. "Better than okay. He's already driving the medical staff crazy, asking when he can start working with students again." Dr. Martinez opened her laptop. "Andre, I'd like to start with some assessment tests. Are you ready?" "Yes, ma'am." For the next 2 hours, Andre worked through problem after problem. Math, physics, spatial reasoning, logic puzzles. His hand cramped from writing, but he didn't stop. He thought of Mr. Thomas on that cold bench, teaching him about load-bearing calculations. Dr. Martinez and Mr. Wong whispered as they reviewed his work. Andre caught fragments. Advanced placement, potential for exceptional spatial awareness. Finally, they sat back. "Andre," Dr. Martinez said, "have you ever been tested for gifted programs?" "No, ma'am. Just regular school tests." She turned to his mom. "Mrs. Williams, your son's mathematical abilities are remarkable, especially his understanding of structural engineering concepts." "Mr. Thomas taught me," Andre said. On the bench, the adults exchanged looks. "That's the other thing," Mr. Wong said. "Tom Wheeler was one of the best minds in Chicago business. If he says this boy has potential..." Mr. Harris pulled out a thick envelope. "These are the preliminary scholarship papers. Full funding through undergraduate and graduate school, provided Andre maintains his grades and continues showing promise in engineering." Andre's mom's hands shook as she took the envelope. "This is real? Really real? Very real?" Mr. Harris smiled. The Foundation Board met again this morning. Tom called in, insisted on it. They've also approved a separate fund for immediate educational enrichment. Private tutoring, advanced classes, summer programs. I can't. Andre's mom pressed a hand to her mouth. "Mrs. Williams," Dr. Martinez said gently, "this isn't charity. Your son has a genuine gift. The foundation exists to nurture talents like his." Mr. Wong nodded. "Tom always said the best investment is in young minds." Andre proved him right. Not just with his abilities, but with his character. They spent another hour going through paperwork. Andre's head spun with terms like trust fund and educational stipend and mentorship program. "One more thing," Mr. Harris said, pulling out a final document. Tom insisted on this. It was a letter, handwritten in Mr. Thomas's neat script. "Dear Andre, by the time you read this, I'll be getting medical treatment, doctor's orders. But I wanted you to know something. You didn't just share food with a homeless man. You showed me that my life's work mattered, that the foundation I built could still change lives. I've instructed the board to create a special division of the scholarship fund, the Bridge Builders Program. It's for young people who show both academic promise and exceptional humanity. You're the first recipient. Your building designs are on my wall already. The doctors think I'm crazy, covering a hospital room with engineering sketches. But I tell them, these aren't just drawings. They're the future. Keep dreaming big. Keep building bridges, not just of steel and concrete, but between people. That's what real engineering is about." Your friend and mentor, Thomas Wheeler P.S. Bring more designs when you visit. And tell your grandmother her cooking saved more than just one life that day. Andre read the letter twice, his vision blurring. His mom read it over his shoulder, crying openly now. "There's a car waiting downstairs," Mr. Harris said. "If you'd like to visit him." Andre looked at his mom. She nodded. "Go," she whispered. "I'll call Grandma. Tell her everything." The hospital was across town, in a tall building with glass walls. Andre clutched his notebook of designs as they rode the elevator to the 10th floor. Mr. Thomas sat in a private room, wearing a proper hospital gown now, but still with Andre's scarf around his neck. Medical machines beeped softly, but his eyes were bright. "There's my engineer," he said, smiling. Andre ran to hug him. Mr. Thomas felt stronger already, his grip firm. "Show me what you've been working on," Mr. Thomas said. Andre pulled out his designs. They spent the next hour talking about support structures and environmental impact, about solar angles and water systems. Mr. Thomas's doctor came in, tried to interrupt, but ended up staying to listen as they discussed innovative healthcare facility designs. "You see," Mr. Thomas told the doctor, "the next generation, always thinking bigger, better." Finally, the doctor insisted Mr. Thomas rest. Andre packed up his drawings. "Wednesday," Mr. Thomas said. "After school. Bring new designs." "Yes, sir." "And Mr. Thomas?" "Thank you. For everything." Mr. Thomas touched the scarf. "No, son. Thank you. For stopping. For seeing me." In the car ride home, Andre looked out at the city. The buildings looked different now. Not just structures, but stories waiting to be told, problems waiting to be solved. His phone buzzed. A text from his mom. Grandma's cooking dinner. Big celebration. Another buzz. From Mr. Thomas. Dream bigger. Always bigger. Andre smiled, already sketching new designs in his mind. The city stretched out before him, full of possibilities, full of bridges waiting to be built. He was ready to start building. A week later, Andre stood on Michigan Avenue, staring at the empty bench. Snow still covered most of it, but he could see the worn spot where Mr. Thomas had sat those few crucial days. "Baby, you okay?" his mom asked, standing beside him. "Yeah, just thinking." They just finished another meeting with the foundation. More tests, more papers to sign. Dr. Martinez had shown them the advanced program Andre would start next semester. Words like accelerated learning and college prep still bounced around in his head. A man huddled in a doorway caught Andre's attention. Not Mr. Thomas. Younger, with haunted eyes and shabby clothes. Andre touched the extra container in his jacket. His grandmother still made extra portions, saying, "There's always someone who needs it." "Mom, can I?" She squeezed his shoulder. "Go ahead. I'll wait here." Andre approached the man slowly, the way he had with Mr. Thomas. "Sir, are you hungry?" The man looked up, suspicious at first, then confused by Andre's extended hand holding the food container. "My grandma's cooking," Andre said. "It's still warm." The man took the container carefully. "Thank you, son." His voice was rough and used. Not many people stop anymore. Andre sat on his heels, keeping some distance, but staying eye level. "What's your name, sir?" "Marcus." The man opened the container, breathed in the steam. "This smells like home. You're not from Chicago?" "Detroit. Lost my job in the auto plant. Came here looking for work, but..." Marcus shrugged. "Things happen." Andre thought about Mr. Thomas's words about seeing people, really seeing them. "There's a shelter 3 blocks that way," he said. "My friend Mr. Thomas told me about it. They have job programs and stuff." Marcus looked up sharply. "Thomas Wheeler? The businessman? You know him?" "Everyone on the street knows about him. He'd give advice, help with resumes when he could. Even when he was out here with us." Marcus took a small bite of food. "Heard he got back on his feet." "Yeah, he's helping me now. With school and stuff." Marcus nodded slowly. "That sounds like him. Always said education was the way up." Andre pulled out his phone. "Sir, can I show you something?" He found the shelter's website, showed Marcus the job training programs, the housing assistance options. His mom had bookmarked it after their first foundation meeting, saying they needed to help others now that they could. "I don't know," Marcus said. "Been on my own a long time. Just think about it." Andre stood up. "They have phones there. You can call home." Marcus's face tightened. "Been too long. Family probably wouldn't want." "My grandma says it's never too long for family." Andre's mom walked over, carrying the coffee she'd bought from the corner store. "Would you like this, sir? It's cold out here." Marcus took the cup with trembling hands. "Thank you, ma'am." "Mom?" Andre asked. "Could we?" She was already pulling out her phone. "I'll call the shelter, see if they have space." 20 minutes later, a shelter van pulled up. The worker who stepped out knew Marcus by sight. Been trying to get you to come in for weeks, she said kindly. Marcus stood slowly, clutching the empty food container. Maybe it's time? He turned to Andre. Thank you, son, for stopping. That's what Mr. Thomas taught me. Sometimes people just need someone to see them. They watched the van drive away. Andre's mom hugged him tight. Your father would be so proud, she whispered. Think Marcus will be okay? The shelter's good. They'll help him. She smiled. Just like Mr. Thomas helped you. They walked to the hospital next, their new afternoon routine. Andre's backpack was full of designs. Ideas for homeless shelters with built-in job training facilities, community centers with sustainable gardens. Mr. Thomas was sitting up in bed, looking stronger. The doctor said he could leave soon, move into the apartment the foundation had ready. There's my architect, he said as Andre came in. Engineer, Andre corrected, grinning. Architects just make things look pretty. Oh, someone's been studying. Mr. Thomas laughed. Show me what you've got. Andre pulled out his latest designs. As they discussed load-bearing walls and solar efficiency, he told Mr. Thomas about Marcus. The Michigan Avenue shelter? Mr. Thomas nodded. Good place. Good people. He knew about you. Said you helped people even when you were... Everyone needs help sometimes. Mr. Thomas adjusted Andre's scarf, still around his neck. The trick is accepting it when it comes. They worked on calculations until the nurse came in for Mr. Thomas's evening medication. Almost forgot, Mr. Thomas said as they packed up. The board approved your summer program application. MIT's Young Engineers Workshop. Andre's heart jumped. Really? 6 weeks in Cambridge. Full scholarship, of course. Mr. Thomas smiled. Think you can handle it? Yes, sir. Good. Because I'll be there too. Guest lecturer. Andre stared at him. Mr. Thomas laughed. Can't get rid of me that easy, son. Still got lots to teach you. On the bus ride home, Andre thought about the bench on Michigan Avenue. About how a simple choice to stop, to see someone, had changed everything. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, sent through the shelter's office, made some calls. Going home to Detroit next week. Thank you for stopping. Another buzz. Mr. Thomas, proud of you, son. Keep building those bridges. Andre looked out the bus window at the city lights coming on. Somewhere out there, Marcus was taking his first steps back. Somewhere, Mr. Thomas was planning more lessons. And somewhere, other people were waiting for someone to stop, to see them, to share what they had. His mom squeezed his hand. Penny for your thoughts? Just thinking about bridges, Andre said, and how sometimes they start with a bench on Michigan Avenue. She smiled, understanding. And some leftover food? And a scarf, Andre added. Don't forget the scarf. The bus rolled on through the evening streets. Andre pulled out his notebook, started sketching again. Not just buildings this time, but connections, possibilities, bridges between where people were and where they could be. One small choice at a time. The next Monday at school, Andre's math teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, called him aside after class. Andre, the principal told me about your scholarship. She pulled out a folder. I always knew you were special. Andre shifted his backpack. Mr. Thomas says it's not just about being good at math. He's right. She opened the folder, revealing his old tests and assignments. It's about seeing possibilities others miss. During lunch, Andre sat with his best friend Marcus, not the man from the street, his friend since 3rd grade. MIT summer program? Marcus whispered. For real? Yeah. Mr. Thomas is going to be teaching there too. Man, and all because you shared your grandma's cooking. Marcus shook his head. That's crazy. Not crazy, Andre said. Just right. After school, Andre took the bus to his grandmother's apartment. She was teaching him to cook now, saying he needed to know how to feed himself at MIT. Not just yourself, she corrected, showing him how to measure rice. Others too. You never know who might be hungry. As they cooked, Andre told her about the man he'd met on Michigan Avenue, his namesake Marcus. He made it back to Detroit, Andre said, stirring the beans. His family was waiting for him. His grandmother nodded. Family's always waiting, even when they don't know it. The kitchen filled with familiar smells, garlic, oregano, hope. Andre's phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Thomas. Board meeting tomorrow. Bringing your community center designs. Wear a tie. Community center? His grandmother asked, reading over his shoulder. Andre pulled out his latest sketches. The building was shaped like open arms, with solar panels forming a roof that collected both energy and rainwater. The ground floor had a soup kitchen and job training rooms. Upper floors held classrooms, a health clinic, and temporary housing. See these angles? Andre pointed. They make the building more energy efficient. And these walls? They're special concrete that helps clean the air. His grandmother studied the drawings. Your daddy used to draw buildings too. But yours are about helping people. That's what Mr. Thomas taught me. Good engineering is about more than just buildings. Later that evening, Andre's mom came to pick him up. She had news. Marcus called the hospital, she said. The one from Michigan Avenue? He's got a job back in Detroit. At the auto plant. Really? Really? Said to thank you for the food. And the push he needed. They walked home through the spring evening. The snow was finally melting, revealing the city beneath. Andre saw possibilities everywhere. Empty lots that could become community gardens, old buildings that could be retrofitted with green technology. His phone buzzed again. Dr. Martinez this time. Test results came in. Starting you in advanced placement next week. Ready? Another buzz. Mr. Thomas. Looked at your community center designs again. Board's interested. Think bigger. At home, Andre spread his drawings on the kitchen table. His mom made hot chocolate, sat with him while he worked. Baby, she said after a while, you know what I'm proudest of? What? That with all this, she gestured to the scholarship papers on the counter, the MIT brochures, his designs. You're still you. Still stopping to help people. Andre thought about that as he refined his designs. The community center grew in his mind, not just a building, but a bridge. A place where people like Marcus could find their way home. Where kids like him could learn to dream bigger. The next morning, Andre got up early. He had 2 containers of his grandmother's cooking in his backpack. One for lunch, one for sharing. Just in case. On the bus to school, he passed Michigan Avenue. The bench was empty now, but he smiled, remembering. His phone buzzed one last time. Mr. Thomas. Board approved initial funding for your community center design. Summer project before MIT. Ready to build some bridges? Andre texted back. Always ready. Dream bigger, right? That's my engineer. At school, Andre started sketching again. Not just buildings this time, but possibilities. Bridges between where people were and where they could be. Between empty benches and full lives. Between small acts of kindness and big changes. His math teacher caught him drawing during class. New design? She asked. Yes, ma'am. A place where people can help each other. She smiled. Sometimes the best equations aren't about numbers at all. After class, Andre walked to his locker. A familiar face waited there. Marcus from Michigan Avenue, cleaned up, wearing a new coat. Heading back to Detroit, Marcus said. Had to say goodbye first. Andre hugged him. You good? Getting there. Got my old job back. Family's waiting. Marcus touched Andre's shoulder. Thank you for seeing me. Mr. Thomas taught me that. About seeing people. He taught you well? Marcus smiled. Keep building those bridges, kid. Andre watched him walk away, then pulled out his phone. Texted Mr. Thomas. Met Marcus before he left. He's going home? The reply came quick. Bridges work both ways, son. You're learning. In his next class, Andre started a new design. A building that looked like hope, shaped like possibility. In the margins, he wrote what Mr. Thomas had taught him. Look for potential everywhere. Stop when others walk by. Share what you have. Build bridges, not walls. Dream bigger. Always bigger. The bell rang. Andre packed up his designs, headed for his next class. In his backpack, 2 containers of his grandmother's cooking stayed warm, waiting to be shared. Just in case someone needed a bridge today. After all, that's how the best stories start. With a simple choice to stop, to see, to share. The rest? The rest is just good engineering.